Daleks are an extraterrestrial race of mutants from the British science fiction series Doctor Who. Will, did you write this?
Yeah, I did, yeah.
It's supposed to be about the difference between language and dialects, not Daleks.
Oh, sorry.
I don't know. What am I going to do about
Dialects.
you?
Exterminate!
No, I was thinking more in terms of a personal improvement plan. I don't think HR approves of extermination. Anyway, no, off you go. Go on, Daleks. Out the way. So languages and dialects are both language varieties. And from a purely linguistic point of view, there's no difference between them. If a linguist looked at a particular language variety that they weren't familiar with, there would be no way of them to tell if it was a dialect or a language. And indeed, if they looked at 2 or 3 such varieties, they might be able to tell the similarities and differences between them, but they wouldn't be able to say which was a dialect of which or what the relationships between them were. The difference between a language and a dialect is a purely social and political one. So to understand that, let's have a look at an example of something called a dialect continuum. About 2,000 years ago, a group of people were living in Jylland, or Jutland in what is today Denmark. For some reason, some of them decided to go west.
Go west!
Oh, we can do without singing Daleks, thank you. So yes, some of them decided to go west. As often happens with these migrations, at each stage, some people liked the new place and decided to stay put, while others maybe hung around for a bit and then decided to start moving again. That's how these Germanic language speakers then started to spread eastwards and southwards into what would become Switzerland and Austria. Quite early on in the migration, this group of people started to speak a bit differently from the people they left behind. With each passing generation, the differences became greater. They pronounced things a bit differently, started having different words for things, maybe learned from other people they'd met on the way. The grammar also changed, with innovation and kids saying things differently from their parents. This process continued generation after generation, with innovations continuing in slightly different directions as people either stayed in a new place or kept moving. The further apart people moved, the more different their speech became. Eventually, we end up with a chain of dialects known as West Germanic, which stretches from Belgium through the Netherlands, the whole length of Germany, and eventually into Austria and northern Italy. In the end, you end up with a chain of language varieties, dialects, whereby people who live quite close to each other can understand each other, but the further apart you get, the more difficult it is to understand. This situation repeats itself in several other parts of the world. So, for example, the Bantu languages have a dialect continuum that goes from Central Africa all the way down to Southern Africa. Turkic languages stretching from the edge of Europe all the way into Central Asia. Chinese languages, especially the Mandarin languages that go from the north of China right down to the south and then across to the west. And the Romance languages, where you get a string of dialects that go from southern Italy all the way up through France and then west through Spain and Portugal. Now these continua, let's be posh, these continua are not always even because of course where there are mountains and rivers in the way, people tend to communicate less, so the differences get stronger even though the distance might not be that great. These kinds of dialect continua were the linguistic situation in most of the world for thousands and thousands of years. Standard languages are a relatively recent phenomenon, and they started off as standard ways of writing. The Florentine dialect in the Italian peninsula became prestigious because of great literature written by people like Dante Alighieri. Martin Luther chose the Saxon dialect in the West Germanic languages for his 1522 Christian Bible in German. He chose that dialect because it was a central dialect and therefore was readily or more easily understood by people in the north and the south. Later still, the development of the nation state led governments to impose a particular language on their citizens as a mark of national unity. And this had a profound effect on dialect continua. If we take two people living on either side of what became the Dutch-German border, for thousands of years they were able to communicate with ease in dialects that were very similar to each other. More recently, though, our friend on the Dutch side of the border starts going to Dutch school, where he learns to read and write standard Dutch. He watches Dutch TV and reads the internet in Dutch. His neighbour, over the other side of the border, does the same, but in standard German. School, literature, reading and writing, internet, work. They're still able to understand each other on a kind of basic level, but whenever they need to use kind of more highfalutin vocabulary or talk about recent inventions, etc., the Dutch guy is going to go with standard Dutch words and the German will go with standard German words, meaning that those kinds of topics are more difficult for them to talk about. At the same time, our two friends will start to believe that the guy on the Dutch side of the border is speaking a kind of Dutch, whereas the German will think that his dialect is a kind of German. Even though he can readily understand the Dutch guy much, much more than he would be able to understand a local dialect from Eastern Austria, which he would probably find completely incomprehensible, even though both people think they're speaking kinds of German. Both of these people are really lucky that the language policies in the Netherlands and Germany have always been relatively enlightened with regards to regional languages and dialects. Not very far away, though, in France, this has not been the case. As early as 1789, the French government, the revolutionary government, released a report on the annihilation of patois and the standardization of the French language. Subsequent governments banned all language varieties apart from standard French in schools and even in the schoolyard, and transgression was very severely punished. Children were humiliated and made to feel ashamed of their language, which they were told was backward and inferior. This is where linguistic snobbery comes in. People who already speak the dialect that happened to turn into the standard feel superior to everybody else. Those who've suffered the humiliation of being told that their way of speaking isn't correct then internalize that prejudice and start to inflict it on others. Some people try to define a language as a collection of dialects that are mutually intelligible, but that doesn't really work. I mean, as we've seen, there's a group of dialects that are spoken by German citizens in Germany that are mutually intelligible if you're close enough together, but not so if you happen to be at the start and end of the chain. And also, intelligible to who? It depends on how much exposure to the other variety you've had, how motivated you are to understand these people, and also your linguistic aptitude. I think basically the Yiddish linguist Max Weinreich was right when he said, "A Sprach ist a Dialekt mit Armee und Flot." Basically, a language is a dialect with an army and navy. So, a language is a language because an authority, a government says it is, and because the people who speak it or speak things similar to it think that it's a language. And that's it. So I really hope you've enjoyed this. If you have, and you've got this far, then please subscribe.
Subscribe.
Thank you.
Subscribe.
Thanks for watching, and bye for now. And
Bye for now.
yeah, bye for now. And watch this one next.
Watch this one next. Enjoy.